Do you sometimes wonder what that means when God says that He will not leave the guilty unpunished, but the children, up to 4 generations later, will still be under that guilt of the sin, or we would say maybe the punishment of the sin, or maybe the consequence of the sin. So I want to talk about that a little bit today. That may help us today, if that is still true today, how the power of sin, the control of sin, the mastery of sin, today we may even call it the grip of sin, how that plays a part in our lives, that sin is controlling, not just the one time we do it, but it's like a lot of things. If you do something once, sometimes it's easier to do it a second time or a third time. And so sometimes it becomes a habit of sin, or sometimes it becomes a habit of an addiction. And so really all continuing sin is an addiction. Oftentimes we think of an addiction as somebody who has a drinking problem or a drug problem or maybe even a sexual problem, but I think an addiction could be any kind of sin. It could be a lying problem or a gossip problem, or a lot of other things that we may fall into. But this grip of sin, maybe as we are more familiar with how it works and what it is, it may help us, and maybe even help us as we try to encourage others as well. So James chapter 1, beginning in verse 13, talks about how sin works. And again, this is probably a familiar verse. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does He tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desires and enticed. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's full grown, gives birth to death. And so here's the picture of temptation leading to sin. So first of all, the temptation is not sin. It's not evil or wicked to be tempted. Jesus Himself was tempted. But once we would say this temptation, He uses an example of giving birth now. Once sin has been born, once we have committed sin, it sounds like it takes on a life of its own. This sin thing is living now within us, and kind of the opposite needs to take place if you've got sin living within you. We're going to get to Romans 6 eventually, but Romans 6 says, what do we need to do with sin? We need to put it to death. Well, why do we need to put it to death? Because it's living within us. So the question continues, well, what do we do with this ongoing struggle we have with sin? Because it is controlling and it has a grip on us. So this is the challenge that we have as Christians, to say, I want to live a pure life, a holy life, a moral life, a godly life. I want to do that, but I still have this struggle with sin. And so Paul deals with that a lot again, Romans chapter 7 and Romans chapter 8. So Paul obviously spends a few chapters in the book of Romans just trying to figure this sin out, its controlling, and how we can overcome it and have victory over it. But now what Jerry just read from Numbers 14, I'm glad he kind of gave it a little bit of a context. So this is when the people were considering going into the land of Canaan, going into Jericho, and then the people said, oh no, we can't do that. There's giants in the land, they're too strong, and they've got fortified cities. And so they refused to go, and then this is when Moses is, could we say, telling God. I was going to use the word reminding, but it's not like God forgot and He said, that slipped my mind, Moses, thank you so much for bringing it up. Not quite that way. But Moses does have this conversation with God. Now this part here about the rebellion and God dealing with the people, that comes from a little bit earlier, and we'll get to that in a minute as well. But here he's saying the Lord is slow to anger, abounding in love, forgiving sin and rebellion. So at this point, God is so frustrated with the people that He kind of wants to get rid of them all. He's saying, kind of let's start all over. This has just been going on for a long time. Probably even before they left Egypt, but definitely since they've been on this road. It's been probably a few months at this point, and they're just rebelling, messing up, sinning, doing their own thing, even to the point of making other gods and worshiping other gods. That will be helpful as we progress here. But God does not leave the guilty unpunished. Okay, so they are going to be punished. Now we know that these people that said, we are not going into the land of Canaan, they were punished. They were not actually allowed to go in. It was only a few people that were faithful. Moses did not go in, but Joshua and Caleb did go into the promised land, but the others did not go into the promised land, so ultimately we say that was their punishment. Wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, that is punishment. But then he goes on to say this, that he punishes the children for the sin of the parents to the third and the fourth generation, right? So we kind of understand everything before this part of the sentence, but this kind of sounds strange to us, that here you've got parents that have sinned, but the children have to bear the consequence of this sin. Well, what does that mean, and how does that work out? So one explanation could be that the parents did sin, but what did they have to do? They had to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. Who else was wandering for 40 years in the wilderness? Their children, right? And maybe their grandchildren as well, as people are being born, or even the people that were young when this all happened. They're the ones who also have to carry on with this punishment of their parents or even their grandparents. We may see something similar when the people went into slavery, right, with the Babylonians. Well, who all went? Just the guilty? Well, the kids went. And then some grandkids were born, I'm sure, in Babylon, right? They were there for 70 years. Back then they may have said that's like 2 generations, but today, a person could live 70 years old, but that's a long time for people that are innocent to bear the punishment and the responsibility of their parents' sins. So we see how it is sometimes passed on from generation to generation. So the point for us today is that sometimes we may sin, but we have to realize that sometimes for us to bear the punishment, the guilt, the shame, kind of what comes after the sin, if the sin especially has a grip on us, that it sometimes can be passed on to our children. And I'm not saying it's passed on genetically, and I'm not saying they inherit our sin, but could they inherit our consequences? Right? So, again, we've got parents that maybe both of them grew up in their own homes, and their parents were drunkards. And then they may grow up to be drunkards, right? Because that's kind of what they learn. That's what they see as normal. That's what people do. They go to work, they come home, they eat dinner, they drink. And they drink until it's bedtime. They're intoxicated by the time they go to bed. Weekend is just kind of a 2-day or 2.5-day party where you drink it. But that's the way people grew up. And sometimes we look at people and say, well, you're 23 years old. How come you're already an alcoholic? So that's all they've ever known. Do you know why? Because their parents were that way. But you want to know something else? Who else do you think hangs around with their parents a lot? It could be nobody, but probably if their parents had friends, do you think their parents' friends drank as well? So like literally all the people growing up drink and get drunk. So that to you is very normal. That's kind of how you live. Now this could be any sin. I just kind of use that as an illustration. Like the sin could be if you're a thief. The sin could be if you're a gossip. The sin could be if you're an atheist. The sin could be really anything. And if your parents are indulging all the time, it has an influence on you. So it may help us to think about our lives to say, what kind of example am I being to other people? But it may also help us to look at the things we struggle with, because it doesn't have to be passed on from generation to generation. I think it has a propensity to do that. Like that's the basic default mold or the idea that maybe you're going to be more like your parents than you really thought you would be. Does that make sense? Does anybody here remember when they're young thinking, when I grow up, I'm not going to be like my parents. When I grow up, I'm not going to do that. When I grow up, I'm going to be a lot different, right? And then maybe you are, but maybe you kind of really look at yourself and go, oh, I'm a whole lot more like my parents than I thought I would ever become like, right? You can change. So I'm not saying you're stuck in that, but it's just easy to fall back into what you know, what you're familiar with, what you've grown up with. And so the question for us is, do we even have things in our life that maybe we don't even recognize, but we got maybe habits. Now I'm talking about bad habits. I'm not talking about good habits or neutral habits, but we've got struggles, we've got sins, we've got things in our life that we almost may look over, and we may say, I'm going to overlook them. I don't even notice them because that just seems to be the way everybody is. That was normal for us growing up. So, and I think that's one way that this can be passed on from generation to generation. It's kind of like the default set mode that children have growing up in a home and being surrounded by relatives and friends who may all act the same way. And if it's good, you may grow up to be good. But if it's evil, you may grow up to be evil. And of course, we know there's no perfect home, so no one can say, well, my parents did everything right, so I'm going to grow up to be a right kid, you know. So it's easy, what we're saying, to inherit what other people have done. And again, it's not biology, it's not chemistry, it doesn't have to do with genetics, it just has to do with training. Now, I don't know, did anybody hear, like, if your parents were alcoholics, your parents grew up and said, listen, when you grow up, you are going to be an alcoholic? No, they don't teach you that like that. They teach you by example, right? You just learn it, that's the way it is. We follow examples a lot of times more than we follow what people actually say. So this is what Moses kind of reminded God of, just saying, these people will be punished. And even the punishment is going to be handed down generationally, and other people are also going to suffer because of the decisions and the sins of the parents. This is mentioned several times in the Old Testament, but another one is in Deuteronomy chapter 5. Now, this is right in the middle of the Ten Commandments. So if you're familiar with the Ten Commandments, this is one of them. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on earth below. So in other words, this is just the commandment, do not make idols. Right? Do not make an idol. Do not worship an idol. Right? Do not own an idol. So in other words, no other gods, just follow Jehovah. So do not make an idol. So it says here, though, do not make these images or the idols that you would worship. You shall not bow to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. Now, of course, this is what we're looking for here, punishing the children for the sin of their parents to the third and the fourth generation of those who hate me. So it's kind of interesting as you read through this, that God is saying, when you make an idol, or even if you didn't make it, maybe you bought one, or maybe you're just thinking about one, but when you worship an idol, something other than God, what does God think about that? He thinks, oh, you're just a little bit off base. I mean, you know, we're still close. We still got a good relationship. I know you still really love me, right? But you just kind of got this idol adulteress, this idol affair thing. You got this little idol sideline. You know, you've got an idol mistress. No, he doesn't even say that. He's saying, you know, if you're going to be an idol worshiper, you hate me. That's what he's saying. You've rejected me. You've given up on me. You've traded me in. You've discarded me so that you can have something else. But he's saying that when people worship idols, it seems like there's a context here. He doesn't say this with all the sins, does he? It's kind of something to do with idol worship. Now, I think, again, most of the other sins in the Ten Commandments, this probably could be true, but for whatever reason, God puts it in with the idol worshiping. If you worship an idol, it's so easy to pass this on to the next generation and the generation after and the generation after that. For some reason, it's maybe just hard to get rid of this sin of idolatry personally. It's in your life. That's kind of the way you grew up, and that's what you're used to. So he's saying he's going to punish the children. And then now again, the punishment could be because the parents are being punished, like in captivity, but it could also be because it's being passed on, this idea of, that's okay to worship idols. I mean, how often did the people of Israel worship idols, yet they still worship Jehovah? They kind of tried to do both, didn't they? So then he goes on to say a little bit more, I think, in this section. Back to Numbers chapter 14, kind of where we started with this idea of the sins being passed on from generation to generation. But there's also the hope that God is a God of love. In accordance with your great love, forgive the sin of these people, just as you have pardoned them from the time they left Egypt until now. So again, we're back to when they sent the spies into Jericho. They didn't want to go in. God said that these people are going to be punished, but then Moses again says, remember your great love. Pour out your great love so that these people can indeed have forgiveness. They can have another chance. They can have grace. And again, as I had mentioned earlier, the idea is you've pardoned them from the time they left Egypt until now. So Moses is like, I'm sure he could hardly count the number of times that God actually had to forgive the people because of their rebellion and their complaining and their lack of faith. You remember when Moses was getting the law, he came down and they had already made a golden idol, a golden calf that they were worshiping. So God had to forgive all these sins, and Moses is like, you've forgiven them all this many times, one more time. Let's just forgive them again. And God did. He was willing to forgive the people. Consequences? Yes. Forgiveness? Yes. So this is kind of how it was being played out, that there were consequences for this sin that affected not only them, but their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. So, again, in life, sometimes it's interesting when you talk to people, and maybe they feel like they are caught up in some kind of sin. And they say, I don't know why I have such a hard time overcoming. I'm trying and I'm struggling, but it keeps coming back and back. And you may even think about a sin in your life that you just find it really hard to overcome. And I wonder if we really thought about it and thought, was this a really strong influence in my life growing up? Is this way Grandma, Grandpa lived? This way Mom and Dad lived? Is this way Aunt and Uncle lived? And I just kind of grew up, and this became a norm that was imprinted on my mind to such a degree that I just have a hard time giving it up. Sometimes in the Old Testament, when the people confessed their sins, so even somebody like Nehemiah, remember when he confessed sins? He first of all confessed his own sin, but then he confessed the sins of the people. But he also confessed the sins of the forefathers. So why is he doing that? Could you imagine, dear Lord, I'd like to confess the sins of my great uncle who's been dead 35 years, but we're going to confess the sin anyway? So what are we trying to do? Save him out of purgatory? Well, no, we don't believe in purgatory. He's not in purgatory. That's not what we're trying to do. Right? We're trying to say, he's sinned. We need to acknowledge that. We need to make sure we don't fall into that same sin because we don't want that sin to have a grip on us. So sometimes it's just acknowledging, and sometimes that's hard to do, isn't it? Especially if your parents have already passed on. To say, my parents in this way, they sinned. They did what was wrong. And I just don't want to do it. I need to acknowledge, you don't have to stand in church and acknowledge in front of everybody and confess your parents' sins, but maybe in your own life you do. Just say, and if that's got a hold on my life, I need to let it go. I need to be free from this. And I think maybe there's power in that when we acknowledge even the people that we love or we admire the most, just because they struggled with something or because they themselves were in the grip of a sin that we would not follow as well. And then, of course, we'd be handing it down to the next generation. That's why it's just hard. Sometimes what's called a generational curse, a generational sin, a generational struggle. And so maybe this is helpful as well. Ezekiel chapter 18 and verse 20 does say this, though. This is kind of the other side, that we're not inheriting their guilt. Maybe we're just inheriting a pattern that they have set for us. The one who sins is the one who will die. So he's saying when people sin, they die. Now that's more of a New Testament theme than an Old one. Sometimes people in the Old Testament, they sinned and they literally died. So we've got several examples of that, people literally dying. New Testament says that we've all sinned and fall short of the glory of God, but the wages of sin is death. The gift of God is eternal life. So we know that the one who sins, they will die. But that's the one who sins. It's not everybody else. It's not that person's friends or that person's children or that person's parents. So if I sin, it doesn't mean my children are going to suffer the consequences of death or whatever the consequences would be. The child will not share the guilt of the parent, nor will the parent share the guilt of the child. The righteousness of the righteous will be credited to them, and the wickedness of the wicked will be charged against them. So you are responsible for your sin. You're not responsible for your parents' sin or for your children's sin, right? They've made their own choice, even if you haven't been that good of an example, or even if you were a little tyrant growing up. I don't know, did your mother ever say that to you, that, you're responsible for my sin, Well, no. Even if you were a little tyrant, your parents are responsible for their actions and their attitudes and their sin. And we're responsible for our own. So it's not the guilt or punishment of sin that's being passed on from one generation to another generation. It's perhaps the consequences. Okay. A few other verses that may help us as we think about overcoming sin. Romans 6, 7, and 8 all deal with this overcoming sin. So we're not going to read all 3 chapters tonight, but we'll just look at a couple here in Romans 6. We know that our old self was crucified with Christ so that the body ruled by sin. That's what we're talking about, being in the grip of sin or being controlled by sin, that we are a slave to sin. That's a term that comes up a lot in these 3 chapters, being a slave to sin. We're ruled by sin, might be done away with, that we should no longer be slaves to sin, because anyone who has died has been set free from sin. So we are set free from sin based on 2 people that have died, right? Christ died for our sins. He died so that we can be set free from sin. So that's one death that's going to really help us to overcome sin. The second one that has died is we have died. So just a few verses earlier, he says, don't you know that all of us who have been baptized into Christ were baptized into his death? And so just as Christ died and was buried through the glory of God the Father, we too have died. We've died to ourselves. We've died to the old way. We've died to sin. We've died to the world. We've died. Now, sometimes, as a Christian, you have a problem keeping the dead person dead, right? That old person, that man of sin, the way of unrighteousness. Sometimes it wants to resurrect itself. So we get tempted again to sin, and we fall into sin. But then there's still continual salvation and forgiveness through Christ. When we walk in the light, as he is in the light, the blood of Christ continues to cleanse us of all sin. So we do have the blood of Christ, his death. We've got the death that we committed to when we were baptized, of dying to ourselves so that we can live for Christ. A little bit later on, same chapter, verse 12 of Romans 6, therefore do not let sin reign. This is the idea of sin having control and power. Don't let it reign in your mortal body, so that you obey its evil desires. Do not offer any part of yourselves to sin as an instrument of wickedness. Rather, offer yourselves to God as those who have been brought from death to life. So again, it's this idea of we are going to die to ourselves that we can live for God. So we no longer have to be under sin's power or sway or grip. We can be set free. It goes on to say this in the next part, Romans 6:13, and offer every part of yourself to him as an instrument of righteousness. For sin shall no longer be your master, because you are not under law, but you are under grace. So because we've been set free, we have freedom, we have forgiveness, we have a new life. And that is because Christ has made it all possible. Because of his life, because of his death, because blood that was shed, a body that was broken, that's what we remember around the Lord's table. Because he raised from the dead, he ascended back into heaven, that we have this life in Christ. So we're going to sing a song that has to do with this concept, right? What can wash away my sin? So that's not just removing the punishment of sin, which is eternal separation from God, which is going to a place called hell. That's the punishment of sin. We've been set free from that. We've been set free that we can have a relationship with God, but we've also been set free so that we no longer need to be under the bondage or the mastery or under the grip of sin. We've been set free because the blood of Christ was going to wash away our sins and set us free. If we can encourage you tonight, if you want to respond, if we can pray with you, if somebody here would like to be baptized into Christ so that they can be born again, live a new life, be set free from the punishment, the consequence, and the power of sin. And if you want to be baptized into Christ, we can do that tonight. Let's stand, we'll sing this song, and let us know how we can encourage you.